Miss Cuthbert.
Aunt Olivia. Sarah.
Olivia.
Mrs. Lynde.
But the devil. Reverend Lee.
Mrs. Lynde.
Rachel.
Reverend.
Rachel.
Reverend Leonard.
Rachel. Reverend Leonard.
Marilla. Reverend Leonard.
Clive Rupert. Fred Bell. Mrs. Lynde.
Mrs. Lynde.
Andrew King. Mrs. Lynde. Felix King. Felix King.
Mrs. Lynde.
Jimmy Spencer. Jimmy Spencer.
Alexander Abraham.
To Alexander Abraham, then. Jimmy Spencer.
Rachel Alexander Abraham.
Matilda Abraham. Marilla. Alexander Abraham.
Rachel
Officer. Felicity. Sarah Stanley. It's Sarah Felicity. Jimmy Spencer. Felix. Jimmy. Felix. Or Jimmy. Mr. Abraham. Sarah. Abraham. Felicity. Mr. Abraham. Rachel Lynde. Felix.
Alexander Abraham. Mr. Abraham is Jimmy Spencer.
Jimmy.
Dr. Blair and Constable Jeffries. Felicity.
Mr. Abraham, Mrs. Lynde, Mr. Abraham, Jimmy Spencer, Mr. Abraham,
Sarah Stanley.
Felix and Sarah. Abner Jeffries.
I'm Alexander, Constable Jeffries, Mrs. Lynde,
Marilla Cuthbert.
Mrs. Lynde, Mr. Riley, Felix,
Mrs. Lynde.
Abner Jeffries.
Felicity.
Matilda Abraham. Mrs. Rachel Lynde. Mrs. Rachel Lynde. Felix.
Alec, the Hetty and Olivia. I said Sarah. You know, Sarah. Felix. To Alec. Rachel Lynde.
Rachel Lynde, and Alexander Abraham,
Miss Cuthbert.
to Mrs. Lynde. Rachel.
Abner Jeffries.
Mrs. Lynde.
Felix.
Felicity. Felix. Felicity or Mrs. Rachel Lynde.
Sarah. Your Aunt Olivia. Felix. Sarah. Felix. Mr. Abraham.
It's Rachel Lynde.
Felix,
Sarah Stanley. Alexander Abraham.
Mr. Abraham.
Mrs. Rachel Lynde.
Matilda. Mr. Abraham. Mr. Abraham.
Mrs. Rachel Lynde.
Mrs. Lynde. Mr. Abraham.
Abner Jeffries. The doctor. The doctor.
is Mr. Abraham, Mrs. Lynde,
Sarah. Mr. Abraham. Mr. Abraham.
Sarah. Felix. Sarah.
It's Felix.
Constable Jeffries.
Miss Cuthbert.
Morning, Janet. And Marilla.
Felix. Janet.
Old Rachel Lynde.
See Janet.
Janet King.
Mrs. Lynde.
Abner Jeffries. Old Rachel Lynde.
Janet. Rachel. Janet King. Felix and Sarah. Rachel.
Sarah.
Mrs. Lynde. Felix.
Mr. Riley. Mrs. Lynde. Dr. Blair.
Rachel,
Mrs. Lynde.
Mrs. Rachel Lynde,
Sarah.
Mr. Abraham.
Oh, Mrs. Lynde.
The doctor. Mr. Abraham. Mr. Riley.
Mrs. Rachel Lynde.
Mr. Abraham. Mr. Riley. Felix.
Where, Janet? Mrs. Lynde.
Mrs. Lynde. Sarah.
Mrs. Lynde.
Dr. Blair.
Constable Jeffries,
Doctor.
Mr. Abraham.
Mr. Abraham. Mr. Riley.
Felicity. Mr. Alexander Abraham.
I think this quarantine business is just poppycock, that's what.